I arrived in this village in late autumn, when the days are already short and the light feels not so much sunny as tired. The road leading there was almost erased from the map. The asphalt ended suddenly, giving way to cracked concrete, and then turned into a muddy track that no one had driven on for years. The navigator showed the destination point, but around me there were no signs of life at all. The forest stood like a solid wall, and only rare gaps allowed glimpses of the gray sky, low, heavy, as if it were pressing the earth down. When the first houses finally appeared ahead, I didn't believe at first that this was the village. They looked like forgotten scenery from an old film: sagging roofs, broken windows, doors hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. No smoke, no light, no traces of people. Not even dogs could be heard. Absolute silence met me so suddenly that I caught myself slowing my steps, as if I were afraid to disturb something fragile and ancient. The air here was different. It smelled not of smoke or human life, but of damp earth, rotting leaves, and cold wood. Every breath felt heavy, as if the very atmosphere of this village was saturated with the memory of what once happened here. I walked along the main street, if it could even be called that, and shards of glass crunched under my feet, mixed with last year's fallen leaves. Somewhere a gate creaked, left unclosed and swaying in the wind, and that sound felt unnaturally loud in the surrounding emptiness. I stopped near the first house. Once it had been lived in, neat, with carved wooden window frames now darkened by time. Remnants of curtains still hung in the window, faded and torn, barely clinging to a rusted rod. I looked inside. The room was empty, except for an overturned chair and a table missing one leg. Yellowed photographs hung on the wall, faces of people who had long since gone, yet for some reason felt more present here than any living being. I moved on. With every step, a strange sense of anxiety grew stronger. It wasn't fear in the usual sense, but something deeper, a feeling that I had intruded into someone else's forgotten, yet still living memory. In one of the yards I noticed an old well. Its wooden frame was half rotted, the lid lay beside it, and inside there was only bottomless darkness. I threw a stone in, but heard no splash, only a dull echo, as if the sound had fallen somewhere very deep and refused to return. The silence here was special. It wasn't simply the absence of sound, but a dense, almost tangible emptiness. Even the wind that occasionally passed between the houses didn't howl or rustle, it merely sighed softly, brushing against dry branches. Birds didn't sing. No insects could be heard. It felt as if nature itself had decided to speak in whispers, respecting what had happened here many years ago. I tried to imagine what this village had once been like. Children must have run through these streets, laughter echoing, wagon wheels creaking, dogs barking. In the mornings people would step out onto their porches, greeting one another, talking about the weather and their work. In the evenings, lights would glow in the windows, and the smell of fresh bread would drift through the street. Now all that remained were ghosts of memories, trapped between the walls and cracks of the old houses. In one of the homes, the door was slightly open. I hesitated for a long time before entering, but curiosity won. Inside it was dark, and I turned on my flashlight. The beam pulled an old stove out of the darkness, its surface covered in cracks. Nearby stood an iron bed with a sagging mattress. On the table lay a book, open in the middle, its pages stuck together from dampness. It felt as if the owner had stepped out for just a minute, and never came back. In the corner of the room stood a child's chair. Small, with peeling paint. That sight was especially unsettling. Children rarely leave on their own. Something must have happened that forced families to abandon their homes forever. I didn't know the history of this village, but I could feel that it hadn't been simple. Perhaps the people were relocated. Perhaps an epidemic or an accident drove them away. Or maybe everything was more mundane. Work disappeared, the young left, the elderly passed away, and the village simply dissolved into time. I stepped outside and noticed the old school building standing a little apart. Its windows were broken, and the door hung on a single hinge. Inside was a long corridor where my footsteps echoed loudly. The classrooms were empty, but on the blackboard in one of them, faint traces of chalk were still visible. Uneven letters, almost erased, reminded me of the last lesson that had once taken place here. I imagined children sitting at their desks, laughing and making noise, unaware that this place would soon be abandoned forever. As the hours passed, evening approached, and the silence became even more oppressive. The sun sank behind the forest, and long shadows from the houses stretched across the ground like dark lines separating past and present. I understood that staying here at night would be difficult, yet for some reason I couldn't force myself to leave immediately. It felt as though the village wanted to tell something, if only I gave it time. I sat on an old bench near one of the houses. The wood creaked softly beneath me, and the sound felt deafening. I closed my eyes and tried to simply listen. At first, nothing happened. Then it seemed to me that somewhere in the distance there was a faint knock, as if someone had gently tapped on wood. I opened my eyes, but everything around me was still empty. Perhaps it was a branch. Perhaps it was my imagination, sharpened by fatigue and the atmosphere of this place. With the onset of dusk, the village changed. It became even more unreal, as if it had slipped out of time. The outlines of the houses blurred, and it felt as though they were about to vanish, dissolving into the darkness. I felt the cold slowly creeping under my clothes and realized it was time to leave. Before going, I looked around one last time, trying to remember every detail, every crack, every shadow. As I walked back toward my car, it felt as if the silence was following me like an invisible companion. Even when I started the engine, the sound of the motor seemed foreign here, almost sacrilegious. I drove away, leaving the village behind, but the sense of its presence stayed with me for a long time. Time passed, but the memories of this place didn't fade. Instead, they became intrusive. Sometimes I dreamed of this village. Empty houses, dark windows, endless silence. In my dreams I walked its street again, and every time I felt that someone was watching me from behind curtains that, in reality, had long since disappeared. I began searching for information about this village. In archives I found only fragments, brief mentions in old documents, dry numbers showing the population shrinking decade by decade. The last record stated that the population was 0. No explanations, no dramatic events, just a fact. As if life here had quietly faded away without leaving a loud trace. But I knew that wasn't the whole truth. Places like this don't empty without pain, without loss, without stories that no one wanted, or was able, to tell. Perhaps every house here held its own small tragedy, and together they formed one great, invisible catastrophe, disappearance. Again and again, I returned there in my thoughts. I remembered the well that gave no sound of water, the child's chair in the empty room, the school blackboard with barely visible letters. All of it felt too real to be just abandoned objects. These were traces of life, interrupted, but not forgotten. An absolutely abandoned village of Russia is not just an empty spot on the map. It is a space where time has stopped, where silence speaks louder than any words. It is a reminder of how fragile human life is, and how easily an entire world can disappear, leaving behind only empty houses and a heavy sense of loss. And perhaps it is precisely in this terrifying silence that its greatest power lies. It forces you to listen, to think, and to remember.